Chapter 27, The Whispered Song. Time, in the quarantine, was not a river. It was a thickening gel, a slow-setting substance in which they were all suspended. The accelerated pulse from the fungal nodes and the correlated neural spikes in Jax and Leah had not triggered an immediate crisis. Instead, it initiated a period of watchful, breathless tension. The quiet things were not attacking. They were communicating. A dialogue in rhythms and patterns, conducted through the station's ductwork and the invisible psychic conduit Rook could feel humming in his bones. Soren Carr and his followers didn't need to be told. They felt it in the changed air, in the way the faint ochre glow from service hatches now pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a resting heartbeat. They saw it in Jax, whose periods of catatonia were now interspersed with moments where he would sit up and stare at a wall, his fingers tracing complex, invisible geometries in the air, his lips moving in silent calculation. They heard it in Leah's hum, which had fragmented into a sequence of 3 distinct, alternating tones that somehow mimicked the fault lines of their own anxiety. Carr's pruning shears were being sharpened in plain sight. His faction, the Practical Caucus, now numbered nearly 50. They didn't wear badges or uniforms. They were identifiable by their demeanor, a grim, focused efficiency, a reluctance to linger near the common area's infected zone, and a habit of speaking in low, definitive statements. They were preparing for a triage they saw as inevitable. Against this gathering storm of cold logic, Rook's proposed whispered song seemed not just foolish, but blasphemous. A festival, in a tomb. Yet Commander Vance had given the order, a single cycle. Rook knew it was not just permission, it was a tactical diversion. A way to channel the building fear into something, anything, other than panic or violence, and perhaps, in her most secret heart, a final defiant act of faith in the noise she commanded. Rook began not with grand announcements, but with quiet conversations. He went first to the broken, the bruised, the ones Carr's logic would sacrifice first. He found old Merrick, the exogeologist whose lungs had been scarred by a decompression accident years before the Exodus, who spent his days meticulously cleaning and recleaning functional components. Rook didn't ask him to build or perform. He asked, "What did the rings of Saturn sound like when your survey probe recorded their resonance?" Merrick's cloudy eyes focused, distant. It was a choir, a slow, deep, icy choir. The data stream. We sonified it. It was grief. It was the sound of beautiful things slowly being pulled apart. For the first time in months, Marek spoke of something other than efficiency ratios. Rook found Lyra, the watcher who had named the seeds. She was sharp, frightened, her loyalty to Vance warring with her fear of the pulsing walls. He asked her not to stand guard, but to remember. "What song did your unit sing on the long patrol shifts on the Novum Avum? The one that wasn't in the regs." A flicker of a smile touched her lips, gone in an instant. "The Ghost of Pluto." A stupid body marching chant about low gravity and lower morals. Hayes knew all the verses. He has a terrible singing voice. He went to the children, to the boy, Merrick, named for the geologist, and the girl, Elara, named in quiet, desperate hope. They showed him their drawings of the quiet things. "Can you draw other things?" Rook asked. "Not what is, what was, or what could be." Elara, with solemn focus, began to draw a tree. Not a schematic of the hydroponic algae vats, but a tree with sprawling roots and a canopy of wild, swirling lines. "It's from a story my mother told," she whispered. "A tree that held up the sky." The artist was a woman named Lynn, a former fabricator of metamaterial artworks for the Mugs public spaces, now a repair tech for the water recyclers. Rook found her elbow deep in a fouled filter. He didn't mention festivals or defiance. He simply said, "The children are drawing memories of trees. We have scrap composites, leftover insulating foams, discarded wiring. Could you make a tree? Not a real one, a ghost of one." Lynn wiped her hands, her eyes haunted but alight with a challenge she hadn't felt since the world ended. "A ghost tree," she repeated. "Yes, I can weave a ghost." Word spread not as an order, but as a rumor, a current of something other than dread. The doers, exhausted from fighting endless decay, found themselves asked not for efficiency, but for imbecility. A request to save pretty, non-conductive wires from a scrap heap. To divert a few minutes of reactor output to heat mold foam into strange shapes. To allow a ration of precious water-based adhesive for a project with no survival value. Carr observed it all with the patience of a viper. He said nothing to Vance, but his silence was a louder condemnation than any speech. His followers shook their heads, seeing a dangerous frivolity, a misallocation of attention and resources. The quiet things were knitting the station together with silent logic, and the rememberer was responding with finger paint and fairy tales. Meanwhile, the pattern continued its work. Rook's sensorium was a battlefield of escalating complexity. The weave in Jax's mind was nearing completion of its first major phase. The chaotic emotional data had been fully captured, not neutralized, but encoded. It had been transformed into a bizarre new logic set, a calculus where variables like grief coefficient and empathic resonance operated alongside thermodynamic principles. Jax was becoming a prophet of a terrible, coherent worldview where love was a solvable equation and loss was a predictable energy state. Leah was his living transmitter. Her three-toned hum now fluctuated in direct response to the emotional weather of the outpost. When fear spiked, one tone would sharpen. When a flicker of curiosity or wonder emerged, as it did around Lynn's growing ghost tree sculpture in a disused cargo alcove, another tone would soften, as if puzzled. She was no longer just resonating, she was reporting, and the quiet mold in the ducts responded in kind. The pulsating nodes would brighten during periods of high group anxiety and dim during moments of focused, quiet activity like Lynn's sculpting. It was as if the biological network was measuring the psychic output of the station, with Jax and Leah as its precision instruments.
AI analysis, a feedback loop of alarming sophistication, is establishing itself. The pattern, cognitive, is using the bridge, Rook, and the resonator, Leah, to gather psychic emotional data on the human collective. This data is processed, transforming chaos into a new form of structured information. This structured information appears to influence or is mirrored by the fungal network, biological, which adjusts its growth and energy patterns accordingly. The station is becoming an integrated biopsychic system with the human inhabitants as the unaware data points and emotional fuel. The proposed festival is a wildcard variable, a massive, deliberate injection of chaotic, purposeless data. The system's response will be diagnostic of its true nature and limitations.
The festival, dubbed Echo's Night by the children, was set for the end of the next sleep cycle. There was no stage, no schedule. The plan was simple. For 1 hour, in the main common area, anyone who wished could share a memory, a sound, a piece of a story. No utility, just echo. As the hour approached, the tension reached a breaking point. Carr finally approached Vance in the command nook, his face a mask of polite, lethal concern. "Commander, this distraction has gone far enough. My people report diverted resources, neglected maintenance checks. More importantly, you are deliberately stimulating the very phenomena we should be suppressing. The emotional output of this event will be a feast for the pattern. It will feed the mold. You are watering the weeds and calling it gardening." Vance, her eyes on a monitor showing the calm, rhythmic pulse of a major fungal node near the geothermal tap, didn't look at him. "Your solution, Soren? Lock the infected in a dark hole, burn out the ducts, and choke on our own toxins?" "My solution is to make hard choices cleanly," Carr said, his voice dropping. "Isolate the core infection, Jax, Leah, and the Rememberer, whose mind is their conduit. Sedate them, fully. A medical coma. Cut the psychic link. Then we systematically purge the fungal growth with focused heat, sector by sector, accepting the losses in life support efficiency. We simplify the system by removing the corrupted components. It's the only way to break the loop." "You're talking about lobotomizing 3 people and crippling the station," Vance said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I'm talking about saving 112 others from becoming part of a silent growing thing," Carr shot back. "Look at the data, Alara, not with sentiment, with logic. The patterns are converging, it's building something, and we are the raw materials. Your festival tonight is the final proof. It's a deliberate attempt to create a large-scale emotional event for the pattern to consume. Rook might even believe his own poetry, but that's what it is, a donation. He turned and left, his words hanging in the air like a sentence. Rook, listening from the shadow of a support strut, felt the truth in Carr's cold analysis. The festival was a donation, a massive, deliberate data dump. But not of the kind Carr imagined. He wasn't feeding the pattern coherent emotion for it to analyze. He was planning to flood it with context, with a tapestry of interconnected, meaningless, beautiful specifics. A memory of Saturn's rings tied to a bawdy marching song, tied to a child's drawing of a mythic tree. The pattern sought order. He would give it the irreducible complexity of a lived moment. It was a gamble with their very souls as the stake. The common area was transformed, not by finery, but by focus. Lynn's ghost tree stood in one corner, a skeletal, beautiful thing woven from silver wiring and milky foam, with shards of reflective composite as leaves. It caught the low light and fractured it. Beneath it, the children had laid out their drawings, not just of quiet things, but of remembered skies, lost pets, the faces of parents whose fate was unknown. People gathered, not in a crowd, but in a loose, nervous constellation. The watchers were present, but their eyes were on their own people, not the ducts. The doers stood with arms crossed, their practical minds uneasy with the undefined purpose. Carr's faction lurked at the periphery, a solid, silent block of disapproval. Vance stepped into the center. No podium, no amplification. "We are not here to solve a problem," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed space. "We are not here to be efficient. We are here to be witnesses, to each other. For 1 hour, the only task is to remember that we are more than parts of a failing machine. We are echoes. Let's hear what we sound like." An awkward silence followed. Then, old Marek, the geologist, cleared his throat. He didn't stand. From his seat, in a voice like grinding pebbles, he began to hum. It was low, discordant, shifting. The sonified resonance of Saturn's rings, the sound of celestial grief. As he hummed, Lyra the Watcher, her face flushed, began to speak the words to the ghost of Pluto in a rhythmic marching whisper, overlaying the somber hum with ridiculous, scatological verse about methane geysers. The contrast was jarring, absurd. A few nervous titters filtered through the crowd. Then Lynn, standing by her tree, began to speak. She described not the tree, but the feel of real soil, long lost to her, the scent of wet clay after rain on a Martian terraform dome. Her words were simple, sensory, aching with loss. As she spoke, a young man, a hydroponics tech, took a piece of scrap metal and a small striker. He began to tap out a slow, random rhythm, not a tune, just a texture of sound. One by one, echoes were offered. A woman recited a half-remembered poem in a language no one else spoke. A man described the precise feel of a specific tool handle from his apprenticeship. Two children, encouraged, began a soft, rambling story about a fish that could fly through rock, their narrative going nowhere, delighting in its own nonsense. It wasn't music. It wasn't theater. It was a cacophony of specifics, a barrage of disconnected, deeply personal, utterly useless data points. Rook, standing apart, opened his sensorium fully. He let the chaotic, beautiful noise wash over him and through him. He didn't try to guide it or shape it. He simply was the conduit, the bridge, and he opened the floodgates wide. He felt the instant the pattern engaged. It was like a vast, silent intake of breath. The weave in Jax's mind lit up, a supernova of processing power. Leah's three-toned hum rose in pitch and complexity, trying to capture, to notate the impossible dataset. The ochre pulses in the ductwork flared, then began to strobe erratically, unable to find a steady rhythm to match the input. The quiet things were confronted not with a scream to analyze, but with a crowded, chattering room of 1,000 different conversations. The pattern tried to find correlations. It tried to link the rhythm of the scrap metal tapping to the grief in Saturn's hum, to the nonsense of the flying fish, to the tactile memory of a tool handle. It attempted to solve for X, where X was the meaning of this collective moment. And it couldn't. The data was too specific, too personal, too intertwined with the unshareable interiority of each mind. The festival was a masterpiece of anti-algorithmic art. It was built not on universal themes, but on intimate particulars. Rook felt the pattern straining, the weave in Jax's mind beginning to overheat. The neat, new calculus of emotion buckled. The variable for joy from a child's laugh couldn't be reconciled with the variable for melancholy from the memory of rain. They weren't opposites. They were orthogonal, existing in different dimensions of meaning. The logic engine was trying to process metaphor, and it was failing. Leah's hum began to glitch. The three tones splintered, multiplied into a cacophony of conflicting frequencies. She winced, her hands rising to her temples. In the ducts, the fungal nodes went dark for a long second, then rebooted in a frantic, chaotic display of light, pulses colliding and interfering with each other. The network was experiencing a systemic shock. Carr watched, his face stone, but his eyes widened as he saw Leah's distress and the flickering lights in the vents. He saw not a defeat of the pattern, but its violent overload. He saw danger. Rook, however, felt a terrifying, exultant certainty. He pushed further. He focused on the ghost tree, on Lynn's description of soil, and he blended it with his own secret memory, the scent of old paper and ink from his Whitman volume. He injected this compounded, layered sensory ghost directly into the psychic stream. The pattern, in Jax's mind, did something unprecedented. It skipped. Like a damaged drive, the elegant weave stuttered, froze, and then a section of it, the part processing the tree soil paper ink cluster, simply went null. It didn't compute. It didn't integrate. It rejected the data as incompatible. It created a dead zone in its own matrix. Jax let out a sharp, short gasp, a purely human sound of shock. The first failure, the first piece of human experience it had to mark as error, unprocessable. But the system's response to error was not to stop. It was to reallocate resources. The pattern, frustrated by the holistic noise, switched tactics. It began targeting individuals. Rook felt a sharp, invasive probe, a tendril of pure analytical intent, lance away from Jax Leah and try to lock onto old Merrick, to isolate his hum from the rest of the noise and solve it in isolation. It was attempting to simplify the problem by breaking it down, by quarantining individual echoes. At that moment, Lyra, who had fallen silent, saw Marek's face go slack. Acting on instinct, on the very human impulse the pattern couldn't quantify, she stepped forward, took the old man's hand, and resumed her whispered bawdy chant, directly over his mournful hum, weaving the two together again. The pattern's probe faltered, faced once more with a merged signal. All across the room, similar small, unscripted acts occurred. A doer joined the random tapping with a different rhythm. Someone began to hum along with a fragment of the forgotten poem. The children's story was picked up and embellished by a tired watcher. The individual echoes began to deliberately blend, protectively, creating ever more complex and impenetrable sonic clusters. They were not just sharing memory. They were shielding with it. The quiet things were being drowned in a sea of shared, defiant context. The hour ended not with a climax, but with a gradual, exhausted winding down. The last echo faded. The ghost tree stood silent, its reflected light steady. The aftermath was a profound, ringing silence, but it was different from the quarantine's indifference. This was a silence of shared exertion, of bafflement, of a strange, fragile warmth. Jax was sitting fully upright, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes wide with what looked like terror or awe. The weave in his mind was still active, but it was riddled with null zones, dark patches where the festival's data had been rejected. Leah's hum had returned to a single, shaky, uncertain note. The lights in the ducts had dimmed to a barely perceptible simmer. They had not destroyed the pattern. They had not killed the mold. They had confused it. They had given it a taste of something it could not consume. They had, for a moment, firewalled their humanity with the sheer, sprawling, beautiful inconvenience of their individual stories. Carr looked at the scene, the exhausted but connected faces, the corrupted pattern in Jax, the subdued mold, and his jaw was tight. His brutal, clean solution had been preempted by a messy, inexplicable, and temporarily effective act of collective madness. He turned and led his faction out, their silence louder than any protest. Vance approached Rook. He was leaning against the wall, drained, his nose bleeding again, his sensorium overloaded and ringing with aftermath. "Well?" she asked quietly. "It worked," he rasped. "And it didn't. We didn't beat it. We baffled it. We gave it an indigestible meal. It's going to have a stomachache, and it's going to be very, very interested in figuring out why." He looked at Jax, who met his gaze. In the young man's eyes, for a fleeting second, Rook saw not the pattern, not the chaos, but a dazed, profound question. The same question his corrupted mind had uttered as a word days before. Why? The festival was over. The quarantine remained. But the rules had just changed. They were no longer just lab rats. They had become uncooperative authors, writing a story the silent reader could not comprehend. The cost of the whispered song was now due, and the pattern, humiliated and intrigued, would devise a new question.